I was wrong about Midnight Motorist. Recently, I made a video talking about Midnight Motorist and its potential connections to FNAF's Curse of Dreadbear DLC, where we see a car with purple headlights and even the Midnight Motorist house itself. However, in my attempts at piecing together a cohesive narrative, I missed one crucial detail that completely changes our understanding of Midnight Motorist. So if that sounds like a lot, we're just getting started. In my original video, I took a fresh look at Midnight Motorist, recapping what we already knew so far as well as what we could assume. By now it's been revealed by 5 Laps at Freddy's that Midnight Motorist is the story of William Afton as the Orange Man driving home from the scene of Charlotte's murder on that same rainy night. We can also be pretty certain that William is drunk here, driving under the influence on his way to kill Charlotte in a drunken rage after getting kicked out of a bar named Junior's close to his house. From there though, things start to get less clear as we venture home where we find a gray person at a couch watching TV. It seems they were meant to be babysitting our son, who appears to have broken out of his bedroom and run off into the night, seemingly lured away by an animatronic. This part of Midnight Motorist is what most theories focus on, debating whether this runaway kid is Michael Afton or the crying child. I showcased both these theories in my original video. However, one aspect I think I actually missed is why these two theories exist in the first place. The reason Midnight Motorist, above most other FNAF debates, remains such a staple nearly 7 years later is its vagueness for a lot of the evidence to either theory going both ways depending on how you look at it. I suggested in my video that the reason for Junior's existence might have been to show William drowning his sorrows after a tragic event like the bite. However, theorists also point out that it's unlikely William ever quite cared for his son enough to get drunk over it, and has instead always been just a bit unstable anyways. Most notably in the Silver Eyes, where he kidnaps Charlotte Emily despite being in a universe where the bite never happened. Additionally, fans like putting heavy focus on the gray person watching TV. I noted that the obvious answer is this is Michael Afton, appearing in his signature gray and watching TV just like we see him doing in Sister Location. However, discrepancies in this dialogue lead some to think that this is instead Miss Afton or even Henry himself, suggesting that his habit of watching TV may make him relate to them in ways he never could to William himself. Even some of the connections we pointed out between Midnight Motorist and Curse of Dreadbear can be thrown into question, like Curse of Dreadbear's emphasis on Glitchtrap, Grim Foxy, and Dreadbear himself. While I connected these 3 characters to William as the driver, Mike as the runaway, and the crying child having already died, you could instead make Mike the couch potato and the crying child the runaway as a bit more of a direct connection. While Midnight Motorist has plenty of these details that come down to interpretation, the minigame ultimately hinges on not only deciding who the runaway is, but also the animatronic who led them away. Regardless of the runaway himself, most interpretations come down to the animatronic being Shadow Freddy, a character who actually came back at the very start of Pizzeria Simulator. If you think Mike's the runaway, then we have a case of Shadow Freddy haunting Mike over his guilt following the bite. If it's the crying child though, we run into some bigger issues. Most fans would claim that Shadow Freddy in this case came from Charlotte's murder that very same night, spawning in and luring the crying child away to find the body of Charlotte Emily outside of Fredbear's. However, we know from FNAF 4 that Shadow Freddy absolutely spawns from the agony of the bite, being confirmed by his clearly broken jaw in FNAF 4, so we know this can't be the case. And that is what one of the biggest points in my original video came down to. While it's not possible for the crying child to have been lured away by Shadow Freddy, there is still one more animatronic we have as a candidate. One of FNAF 4's other biggest debates comes down to the identity of the Fredbear plush, a character behaving a lot like Golden Freddy, following the crying child around and encouraging him from day to day. We know this isn't William since he's working at Fredbear's at the same time. Additionally, FNAF 4 makes it very clear that the Fredbear plush in FNAF 4's ending, who'd be way more likely to be a spirit like Charlotte, is not the same one we're talking about due to their different text colors. So who really is the first speaker? Well, the survival logbook actually gives us a huge hint which most fans might have missed. On a page in the survival logbook featuring the crying child's possessed Fredbear plush, the book specifically talks about an imaginary friend, begging the question of if the Fredbear plush was actually the crying child's imaginary friend talking to him all along. While an imaginary friend would explain how the Fredbear plush talks to the crying child when not with him, and makes a lot of sense considering who the Fredbear plush could have been looking only at the context of FNAF 4, we also have to remember how FNAF 4 doesn't always play by normal rules. Five Nights at Freddy's often plays on the fact that fears come to life in more ways than just one, and I think this can be seen all the way back in FNAF 4. I think the crying child's Fredbear plush isn't some normal imaginary friend, but instead an actual entity manifested from his fears and emotions like we've seen elsewhere in the series. It's my belief that this entity is actually what precedes Shadow Freddy, accompanying the crying child as an imaginary friend before being corrupted by the agony of the bite, becoming what we now know as Shadow Freddy. So, if the crying child had an imaginary friend who manifested as an actual entity, is it possible that they could be the footprints in Midnight Motorist, simply a version of his friend Dreadbear accompanying him like we see in FNAF 4? When I do these videos, I always like to have a linchpin, one thing I can be certain of despite all other information and reasoning. The linchpin in my original video was asking that exact question, asking if the crying child's imaginary friend could actually be the footprints. It's obvious that the crying child's fears of Dreadbear could create an imaginary friend, but what I had to ask myself was if that friend could actually fully manifest, leaving physical footprints like we see in Midnight Motorist. And my answer was no. In my mind, I imagined the crying child's fears wouldn't have been strong enough to create an entity that could physically exist. And if they were, I imagined this might have created a paradox where if he were indeed that scared, there's no way he'd run off into the night with a manifestation of his greatest fear. That answer is ultimately what left me to conclude Midnight Motorist being about Michael Afton being haunted by Shadow Freddy, coming from the mound where the crying child had been buried out in the woods. However, after posting that video, less than 2 days later, I would come to discover one thing that changed my entire outlook on Midnight Motorist. Let me ask one question. Where is this bedroom? That might sound like a stupid question, because it's obviously underground as a part of William's nightmare experiments. And while you are correct, I don't think that's the whole answer. In my last video, I took another look at FNAF's experiment rooms and realized that we've had them backwards basically this whole time. While the experiment rooms were created to ground the story of FNAF 4's nightmares, Scott inadvertently created another debate over who those experiments were for. In my opinion, we've been trying to cram Michael or the crying child into a part of the lore they don't belong in as the experiment victims, when in reality it was actually their nightmares that inspired those experiments in the first place. So if the nightmares were real nightmares had by one of them at some point, and this room likely is too, then where is it? Well, let me ask another question. When FNAF 4 had just released, what was this house? FNAF 4 immediately goes from this title screen to a completely different house in the minigames, so what might Scott have been getting at here? Some might think this was the modern day house of Mike Schmidt, being haunted by the nightmares like FNAF 4 implied. However, it's clear from sister location that he's instead still living in the same neighborhood he grew up in FNAF 4, so that can't be the case. From there, the only conclusion you can draw based on the nightmares outside of this house in the first place is that it's the house containing the FNAF 4 bedroom. So why does this bedroom completely change the meaning of Midnight Motorist? It's because this is unarguably the crying child's bedroom, and that means he lived in and was alive for the events of Midnight Motorist. I was wrong about Midnight Motorist and my assessment of whether or not the footprints were impossible. In the case of whether or not the crying child's imaginary friend could leave those footprints, I guess the answer is yes. And this is something that was likely reflected in the FNAF movie itself. Up to now, we'd mostly seen Shadow Freddy associated with luring people away, both in Follow Me and potentially the novel trilogy, though that's the one people actually argue about. That shadowy Freddy is never mentioned again in the novels, leading some to think it could have actually been Golden Freddy the whole time. And they certainly might have a point when looking at the movies with Golden Freddy luring a babysat Abby away to Freddy's. So if we're changing pretty much everything we thought we knew about Midnight Motorist, what does this all mean? Well, for starters, like we discussed in the last video, placing Midnight Motorist has always been the key to placing Charlotte's death. And in this case, she does appear to die before the events of FNAF 4. From there, instead of the Aftons moving away from Fredbear's after the bite, it appears that they instead move closer to Fredbear's sometime after Midnight Motorist. Maybe that's what William was talking about when he said he'd be sorry when he gets back. Most fans attribute this to some convoluted punishment involving the nightmare experiments, but this might just be a case of William keeping a much closer eye on the crying child from here on out, which could involve a certain plush observing the crying child in their new neighborhood next to Fredbear's. Ultimately, the only big problem I have with this interpretation of Midnight Motorist is that it just doesn't do the mound justice. I still stand by the fact that it can't be a twisted one or some secret entrance to sister location, and without the crying child being dead yet, I'm a bit out of luck. Best backup I could think of is another missing kid's body, but with Midnight Motorist even earlier in the timeline than we first thought, that seems pretty improbable. I would like to believe the mound still has something to do with the nightmares, but can't exactly prove that since the nightmares might instead be what the crying child brought home from Freddy's or Fredbear's instead of having any actual connection to the mound. At this rate, I'd actually be very worried about the mound becoming the next box. After all, it has been the most perplexing topic for some time now, and if debate about it becomes too big for the actual answer to live up to, then it might just be best left forgotten for now. Rest assured though, I absolutely don't think the mound is the linchpin to at least placing Midnight Motorist. While there might be some debate over what makes a good counterpoint to either theory, I think that the placement of the crying child's room and nightmares in this house is pretty dang solid, and a way better linchpin than what I thought I knew about the footprints last video. So now that we know the actual story of Midnight Motorist, next time we'll be taking a look at what actually happens to the crying child himself. And trust me, we're just getting started.